One common talking point, especially recently, of white nationalists and the alt-right is the situation going on in South Africa. What exactly is going on in South Africa? It's honestly a long story. I'd like to start off by saying I'm not claiming to have a full understanding of the situation myself. I've done my best to research the case, but it's a messy one, to put it lightly. If there's any information I missed, I'll be happy to hear about it in the comments below. And if I find that this video doesn't adequately cover the topic on either side, I'm willing to make a follow-up video. From what I've seen of the issue so far, it's largely based on anecdotes of horrendous crimes committed against white farmers living in South Africa. These attacks have been going on largely since the end of apartheid. The people who talk about these events claim that these people are being targeted based on their race. Now I would argue that if this were happening the other way around, this would be considered more than enough evidence of a white supremacist conspiracy targeting blacks. The narrative that blacks are being targeted by police all across the nation has been fueled by anecdotes of black men and a few black women who were killed by police, and through largely ignoring anything that happened prior to that which might have warranted the shooting. The first case was Trayvon Martin's, which, while not involving a cop, still involved a guy who shot a black kid, but largely ignored the circumstances surrounding it. And pretty much all the evidence to suggest it had been in self-defense was largely ignored. Now I can agree that Zimmerman probably shouldn't have been following Trayvon, but I find the notion that he hunted him down and killed him in cold blood because he was a white supremacist to be ludicrous. Especially when you consider the images of him pleading after the event and the fact that he wasn't even white, he was Hispanic. And in pretty much every police shooting anecdote, even the ones that are undeniably unjustified, there is little, if any, evidence to suggest the officer targeted them for being black. And unlike events like those, these farm attacks can't be justified on the grounds of self-defense, as the farmers are on their own land and are being tortured. You can't torture someone in self-defense. If you're in a position where you're able to actually torture them, then they can't be much of a threat to you. So suffice it to say, if we were to set the standard of proof needed to assert that white farmers are being targeted at the same level we do to prove that America has this invisible system of white supremacy in place to oppress and murder blacks, then hands down that burden of proof is met. However, I don't set the standard of proof for there being an invisible system of white supremacy that low, and as such, I have to set the standard of proof of white farmers being targeted for their race much higher. So the South African government, as well as many on the left, argue that whites aren't being targeted, and that this is nothing more than a symptom of South Africa's wider crime problem. Indeed, while these absolutely horrible crimes are by no means excusable, that doesn't mean it's part of a greater scheme to enact a white genocide, even if they are racially motivated. Just like how hate crimes against blacks in America don't prove that there's some kind of scheme to genocide blacks. While crime is obviously not something we should accept, we ultimately can't get rid of it entirely. So that begs the question, is there any evidence to suggest the attacks are part of something greater? Some have argued that the farm attacks are secretly being carried out by the government, and the evidence for this includes Jacob Zuma, South Africa's 4th president, singing a song called Shoot the Boer. For those of you that don't know, the term Boer means farmer, and it is typically used in reference to descendants of the white settlers in South Africa. Jacob Zuma claims the song is merely anti-apartheid and isn't meant to incite actual violence, a claim which is questionable to say the least. For what it's worth, Zuma did agree to stop singing the song in 2012, and given the country's history with racial tensions, it's difficult to use this song to prove definitively that Zuma must be in cahoots with the individuals committing these acts. A more substantial bit of evidence would be the fact that Zuma called for confiscation of land from white farmers without compensation. A similar event happened in Zimbabwe where Robert Mugabe sent people to seize the farmlands from white farmers. They murdered many of them, and Mugabe made it clear that he wouldn't prosecute them for such actions. However, this still isn't definitive proof. Another point of contention is whether or not the attacks are racially motivated at all. One counter-argument to the claim of it being a matter of overall crime is the fact that the average of murders for the overall country is 34 per 100,000 people, but the rates for farmers is around 130 per 100,000 people. Opponents to the claim argue that while the murder rate is higher than the collective murder rate, it's still lower than in certain parts of the country, but from what I understand, these areas are in more urban locations, whereas the farm murders are obviously in rural areas that tend to be more isolated. To put it plainly, a farm murder is something that would typically require more planning, and while deaths are statistically more likely to happen in rural areas, this is largely based on accidents. Homicide rates are still typically higher in urban areas. Another counter-argument to the assertion that the attacks are racially motivated is that not all of the farmers killed were white. The last time the government kept count on this thing, they found that at least a third of those who were victimized were in fact black, which is disproportionate given how much of the farmland is owned by whites. However, these stats are from 2001, and there is a fairly good chance that the numbers have changed drastically since then. The South African government claims that these attacks are simply robberies. To some extent, this could be reasonably argued. Given the isolated nature of the farms, it's possible that they're seen as an easy target for robbery. However, some argue that this can't be the case given the barbaric nature behind many of the attacks, in which the victims are tortured. Now, it could be argued that the purpose behind this is to gain access to safes and find out where valuable items are being hidden, and this is where things get kinda messy. On one hand, it would make sense that torture might be used to gather information, but one could argue that the severity of the methods of torture implies that this isn't the case, especially if the victim is murdered and therefore can't testify on the motive. It could also be more effectively argued that the fact that many of the attacks involve the torture of innocent children, that this isn't the case, since it would make less sense to torture children if the only goal was finding information that they may not even have. So are white South Africans targets of genocide? From the evidence I've been able to gather so far, I can't really say yes or no. Whether the acts are of genocide or not, I think we can all agree that they are horrible and should be dealt with. But with that being said, anecdotes only prove so much, and the actual statistics that could potentially prove one way or the other aren't there. So it could be the result of an organized attack on whites, or it could be an issue of general crime in South Africa. If there's any evidence I missed, I'd be glad to hear it in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.